But I don't know where the last video cut off. I'm afraid I wasn't paying attention to the time. I usually watch the monitor to see the time when it comes round. So we'll just go back a little bit. We had Lot, of course, fleeing from the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and afraid to completely trust God, so he wouldn't go into the mountains, but went to the town of Zoar. And it was afterward that he actually, because of his fear again, decided, well, he would go up into the mountains and live in the cave with his two daughters. That's where the two daughters seduce him so that they can bear seed. And we had taken up the story a little bit of Hagar. When Sarah gave Hagar, her handmaid, to Abraham, because, again, this fear, they were overwhelmed. They had faith in God, but to trust in the promise was simply beyond their capacity as humans to understand how this could take place at such an advanced age. So Hagar, the slave girl, is given to Abraham, and he takes her as a concubine, a wife, and she becomes pregnant. And then, because she became pregnant but Sarah didn't, she becomes condescending towards Sarah. And Sarah begins to maltreat her to the point where Hagar flees. Now, when Hagar comes to a point in the desert where there's a wellspring, and God's angel appears to her and gives her the command to return to the tent of Sarah and Abraham and submit herself to her mistress, because her child is going to be blessed and made a significant ancestor. And she turns and by the wellspring, and the wellspring becomes called the wellspring of the living one who sees me. I think I mentioned, I think in King James Version it's left as Bir Laharoi, because somebody didn't know how to translate it. But the significance of this wellspring of the living one who sees me is a point that we want to make here. Because, again, later, when Abraham dies, Isaac will move his household and his flocks up, and he will dwell by the wellspring of the living one who sees me. And very significant, because when Moses comes to the Mount of Sinai and he's told that he's to go back into Egypt and bring the people out, and he says, "Who shall I say has sent me?" And what's said on the Mount of Sinai is, "The living one has sent you." We in Greek say ego imi o on, the I am, the existing one, or the living one. I am that I am, as in English, but really the living one. Tell him that I am the living one. And they have that tradition from Abraham and the time of Abraham, coming down through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, that their God is the living one who sees me, the living one. And that is the name by which they will recognize him, Yahweh, Jehovah, the living one. And they will know that this is the God of their father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from the tradition that has been given them. And here God actually has a name that he can be called by uniquely. The Jews will later be afraid to pronounce the name or write it, and they will write it as the famous tetragrammaton, Yahweh, and YHVH. It's usually how we do it in English. We'll have a tetragrammaton in the New Testament as well, by the way, ICXC, Jesus Christos. And this is where we find out who is being spoken about on the Mount of Sinai, and why the Jews are going to recognize that name when Moses says it to them. So it's really very significant to bear this in mind and to remember it. The thing is that Abraham is a little dubious. He has faith in God, but trusting that he's going to bear a child is really fairly beyond himself and Sarah. A little later, of course, he's going to be called upon to certify that trust. Somewhat as Peter was asked 3 times, "Lovest thou me?" after he betrayed Christ thrice. But anyway, the story of Hagar and Ishmael is extremely important. And it is there that we have this first identification directly of God as the living one, as a name. And we see in the Old Testament, sometimes people talk about the 2 stories of the creation, and one of them is called the Elistan or Elohimistan, one is called the Yahvist or Yahvist story. And I think the reason is because El is a generic name. It just means God or divinity. It's not an actual, like, personal name, like Jesus Christ or something. And then when, through Abraham, the covenant is established, in order to establish a covenant, you don't have a generic name, you have an actual name. So then here, God has revealed himself as the living one, or Yahweh. And I think probably the priestly redactors, when this tradition was handed down and recorded, as they copied it, they moved the name Yahweh back in time, because it was the name by which they knew God. And El, of course, isn't a name, it's just a generic term for God or divinity. So this sort of moving the name back in time as they copied it and establishing it earlier than it was actually revealed. So it's not actually that we have 2 complete different traditions coming from 2 different sources, or 2 different groups, religious groups within Israel, within the Hebrews, but just that the copyists moved that name back in time as they're copying, because by then, of course, they simply refer to God by the name that he revealed himself in giving the covenant. The covenant requires a name. And this covenant with Abraham is also fascinating, because Abraham, through the male prophets, the Messiah is revealed. The Messiah of the promise. Through the female prophets in the Old Testament, the church is revealed. So that in these marriages between these great people, we have, as Paul said, marriage, a type and likeness of Christ and the church. The promise was made to Abraham. The promise could only be fulfilled through Sarah. The promise could not be fulfilled through Hagar. God had made the promise to Abraham and Sarah as ones who had a monogamous relationship that clearly revealed Christ and the church. The mistress, the handmaiden, couldn't be the source of the fulfillment of that promise. It had to be his monogamous wife, given to him by God, as a revelation that Christ and the church are one, and that this is a special union that reveals this mystery to us. And I think we'll take this up a few times as we proceed through the Old Testament. It's very important that we understand in the crowning service in the Orthodox Church why we mention all of these Old Testament prophetic couples. And we bless the couple who are being crowned with that blessing, Zipporah and Moshe, Zipporah and Moses, Abraham and Sarah, and these couples like that. So we see how marriage is a type and likeness of Christ and the church. And then we begin to understand that the crown of thorns on Christ's head is, of course, his wedding crown with which he's crowned to the church as his bride. So this is important to bear in mind and to remember. The promise could be made to Abraham and the covenant established. It could only be fulfilled through Sarah, his lawful wife. And she was included in the covenant and the promise. And this is a revelation really about Christ and the church, because the church will be old and barren, fallen together with Adam and Eve, and restored anew in Jesus Christ, when the church will again bear the fruit of salvation. So it's important to remember that, and the wellspring of the living one who sees me, we'll come across it again in the story of Isaac, and we'll come across it again in Moses on